They were supposed to be property, bought, sold, and worked to death on sugar plantations. But in the mountains of Jamaica, escaped slaves built something the British Empire couldn't destroy. For nearly a century, these warriors called Maroons fought the world's greatest military power to a standstill. They won battle after battle. They freed hundreds of slaves. They built free African kingdoms on Caribbean soil. And then, at the moment of their greatest strength, they made a choice that would haunt them forever. In 1655, British warships thunder into Jamaican waters, cannons blazing. The Spanish flee inland, abandoning their colony. In the chaos, roughly 1,500 enslaved Africans see their chance. They break their chains and run for the mountains. The Spanish had called such runaways cimarrones, wild, untamed. The British would come to call them Maroons, and they would spend the next 80 years trying and failing to destroy them. However, the British had bigger plans for Jamaica. Sugar, the white gold that made men wealthy beyond imagination. But sugar plantations required something more valuable than gold: human bodies that could be worked to death and replaced. Therefore, slave ships began arriving with horrifying regularity. By 1700, Jamaica's enslaved population exploded from 550 to 45,000 Africans. The labor was so brutal that many died within years. Disease, malnutrition, and unimaginable violence maintained the system. Yet everyone knew that somewhere in those mountains lived people who'd escaped this hell. And occasionally, usually at night, the Maroons returned. They burned plantations, killed slaveholders, stole weapons and supplies, and most importantly, they freed slaves, bringing them back to the mountains to taste freedom. By 1720, the British had a problem they couldn't ignore. Deep in the Blue Mountains, perched on a 900-foot ridge overlooking the Stony River, sat Nanny Town, home to hundreds of Maroons. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a thriving West African village transplanted to Caribbean soil. Women planted yams and cultivated crops. Men hunted wild game. Children were born free, knowing nothing of chains or masters. The settlement was organized like an Ashanti kingdom, maintaining traditions and languages from the motherland. And it was led by someone extraordinary, a woman the Maroons called Nanny. Some say she was born in present-day Ghana in the 1000. Others claim she arrived in Jamaica already a free woman. What's certain is that by 1725, Nanny had become the spiritual and military leader of the Windward Maroons and the British colonial government's worst nightmare. But Nanny wasn't alone. In western Jamaica, another leader was rising. His name was Cudjoe, likely born free, the son of rebels who'd escaped during an earlier uprising. The Leeward Maroons under his command controlled the cockpit country's rugged terrain. Two Maroon nations, east and west, both unconquerable. The Maroons had advantages the British couldn't counter. They knew every trail, every cave, every ambush point. They used the abeng, an African horn, to send coded messages across mountains. They disguised themselves as bushes and trees, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Their warriors had come from the Gold Coast, captured during West African wars and sold into slavery. These weren't frightened farmers, they were trained fighters who'd survived the Middle Passage and refused to stay enslaved. In 1728, the British finally decided to crush the Maroon threat. They sent professional soldiers, experienced militia, and local forces. The campaign was meant to last months. It lasted over a decade, and the British lost almost every engagement. Lieutenant Philip Thicknesse, a British officer, would later write in stunned disbelief about fighting warriors who seemed to materialize from thin air, strike with devastating precision, then vanish before reinforcements could arrive. In 1730, the Maroons went fully offensive. They raided plantations along the mountain bases, freed slaves by the dozens, and inspired terror among colonists who realized their empire of violence could be challenged. The British sent wave after wave of troops against Nanny Town. In 1732, They finally captured it, occupying the settlement with hundreds of soldiers. Victory seemed assured. But the occupation proved too expensive to maintain. When they withdrew, the Maroons simply walked back in and reclaimed their town without firing a shot. In 1734, British forces found a narrow path that allowed them to approach Nanny Town from an unexpected angle. They brought small cannons and bombarded the settlement, burning huts and forcing the Maroons to flee. Nanny led her people deeper into the mountains. The British celebrated, but their celebration was premature. From new hideouts, the Windward Maroons continued fighting. They ambushed patrols, raided coastal towns. In one engagement, they conquered a military fort in St. George, killing defenders and seizing weapons. The British colonial government was hemorrhaging money and men. Sugar exports declined. The white population dropped to barely 7,000 against nearly 100,000 enslaved Africans. Jamaica was under martial law, teetering on the edge of complete collapse. By 1739, the British faced an impossible situation. They couldn't defeat the Maroons militarily. The war was bankrupting the colony. Slave rebellions were spreading across the island, inspired by Maroon victories. Therefore, they offered something unprecedented: peace. Representatives approached Cudjoe with gifts and hostages, proposing a treaty. The terms seemed generous: 1,500 acres of land, autonomy over their settlements, freedom to hunt and trade, recognition as free people. But there was a price, a terrible price. The Maroons had to promise to help capture runaway slaves and return them to bondage. They had to assist in crushing future slave rebellions. They had to become enforcers of the system they'd escaped. Some of Cudjoe's warriors were outraged. This was betrayal of everything they'd fought for. Escaped slaves had always been able to find refuge with the Maroons. That's what made the mountains a beacon of hope. However, Cudjoe saw something his warriors didn't. The British couldn't defeat them militarily, true, but they could slowly starve them out, prevent new recruits from joining, isolate them until the Maroon communities withered. This treaty guaranteed survival, safety for his people, land that couldn't be taken. It was pragmatic, it was necessary. It was also devastating. Cudjoe signed the Treaty of the Leeward Maroons became, in effect, an unofficial police force for British slavery. The Windward Maroons initially refused. Nanny reportedly opposed the treaty, viewing it as another form of enslavement. But by 1740, facing pressure from both British forces and the Leeward Maroons, Queen Nanny's co-leader signed a similar agreement. Nanny established New Nanny Town, now Moortown, on 500 acres. She died around 1750, having secured freedom for her people, but at an impossible cost. The treaty's consequences were catastrophic for enslaved Jamaicans. The mountains were no longer sanctuary. The Maroons, who'd once freed slaves, now hunted them. Massive slave revolts in following decades were crushed with Maroon assistance. Yet the Maroons survived. Their communities endured for centuries while slavery crumbled around them. When Britain finally abolished slavery, Maroon towns remained autonomous, their treaties still honored. 4 Maroon communities remain in Jamaica today: Moortown, Accompong, Scots Hall, and Charlestown. The Jamaican Maroon Wars proved that enslaved people could organize, fight, and win against colonial powers. That free black communities could thrive in the Americas despite overwhelming opposition. That resistance was possible even when victory seemed impossible. But they also revealed the brutal choices survival sometimes demands. The Maroons saved themselves by abandoning others. They secured freedom by enforcing bondage. They won by compromising the very principles that sparked their rebellion. History doesn't deal in simple heroes and villains. The Maroons were warriors who defeated an empire. They were also people who made impossible choices to ensure their children could grow up free. Today, in those same Blue Mountains where Nanny once commanded her warriors, descendants of the Maroons live on lands their ancestors bled to secure. The treaties signed nearly 3 centuries ago still stand. They are living proof that even when empires seem invincible, resistance can create spaces where freedom survives.